Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Walt here from Down the Block Sports, and today I want to talk about the NBA. The trade deadline is just a few weeks away. We're going to talk about another possible trade candidate, this time on the Detroit Pistons. The Pistons are one of the worst teams in basketball, have a quality player on the wing. Where could he play after this trade deadline? We're going to talk about it right here on Down the Block Sports. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more of my exclusive content. Joining me to talk more about the trade deadline and the trade future of Jerami Grant is Kyle Russo from Review and Preview Sports. Kyle, what's going on, man? Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, man. I appreciate, as always, the invite, and looking forward to talking some basketball with you here today.
So the player we're talking about today is Detroit Pistons forward Jerami Grant, who is having a really good season. He is injured right now, something we'll get into very shortly, but on the year averaging 20 points, nearly 5 rebounds per game. He is a player who could really play for any team in the NBA due to his positional versatility. But Kyle, talk about who Jerami Grant is, what his injury is, but the type of player he's going to provide to multiple teams around basketball that could be interested.
He'll be a really key contributor to any team that really trades for him. Again, he's not going to be the number one of any team, the number two of any team, but he'll be a solid number three option, like you alluded to, Alec, a 20-point per game scorer. He's averaging around 41% from the field overall. Good free throw shooter. Not so great of a three-point shooter, but averaged around 5 rebounds as well. And we saw him really come onto the scene back in 19 and 20 when he was playing for the Denver Nuggets, and then he signed that big long contract with, I believe it was a 3-year contract, $60 million in total with the Detroit Pistons. He's in the second year of that contract. And the season that he was having last year, Alec, as well, in year one with the Pistons, if you do remember, a year ago around this time, people were talking about Jerami Grant as the top trade candidate in the NBA at this point in time
Yeah.
based on how he was playing. And he was playing at a tremendously high level, and obviously the Pistons didn't want to move on from him. I would say the biggest, because Jerami Grant is a great player, don't get me wrong when this comes out of my mouth, is that I think the skepticism with him is that he's doing this essentially as the number one option in Detroit. So
Yeah.
how will he do as a solid third, maybe even fourth option on some teams that we're going to talk about here today on another team, and what he can contribute to those teams offensively?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Grant's game, 6'8", 210, the long, lanky forward can play the three, play the four, help defensively, very versatile, has also provide some quality offensive production the last few seasons. So there's no reason for the Detroit Pistons to keep him. They're a rebuilding team right now in the NBA. They might as well maximize their value with Grant while they can. He's making $20 million this season and just under $21 million next season. So, Kyle, let's jump into some teams who could possibly trade for Jerami Grant. Who is your number 5 team for the Pistons winger?
So my number 5 team at this point in time, Alec, is the Los Angeles Lakers. And this is a team that's been tied to him, like I alluded to in my previous comments, is that this is a team that's been tied to him since last season as well, to potentially trade from the deadline. And I think that what you're seeing in this Lakers season is that ultimately it's sinking, and it's sinking fast. You're hearing more and more
Fast.
rumors every single day that, obviously the Russell Westbrook experiment has not panned out. You're hearing the talks about how they could have had DeMar DeRozan instead. And obviously you're seeing how he's doing in Chicago. He's playing like an MVP candidate, and what that could have been on the Lakers. Some of their key players that they added this offseason are not really doing a great job. You have one of their key young players that they added in Kendrick Nunn, who has yet to play a game for them, solid guard depth off the bench. But this is a team that's built up of really old players that were all stars, but have kind of really been moved past their prime, right? You know what you're going to get out of Carmelo Anthony. You know, essentially, at least at this point in time, what you're going to get out of Russell Westbrook. Anthony Davis continuously gets hurt and is hurt at this point in time. And LeBron James does everything in his power to possibly try to win, but they cannot do it. They cannot do it, and they are sinking fast. Frank Vogel is now on the hot seat, probably hotter than ever at this point in time. A lot of people thought he was going to get fired off after that Denver loss. And a reason why I'm having the Lakers as no longer one of my top teams, because I think that they were upon a top team for this candidate in Jerami Grant a while back. But because of the fact that they just have nothing to really give at this point in time, I have them all the way down at 5. And with that being said, that trade would look like a first-round pick, which unfortunately that first-round pick, the earliest first-round pick the Lakers can trade, is in 2027. With that being said, they'll add in maybe a DeAndre Jordan, a Taylor Horton Tucker, and maybe a Kendrick Nunn as well. That way they get some young, good players as well as a first round pick in there for the Detroit Pistons in exchange for a Jerami Grant.
I certainly think Grant would make sense for the Lakers. He'd provide some much needed energy for a team that really is losing it pretty quickly. The only problem I have with the Lakers, and the reason I didn't have them on my list, is because I really don't love their trade assets. I think Detroit can get a much better offer from much better teams. So the Lakers certainly should be active. They have no reason not to. With LeBron James being 37 years old, they have to try and find a way to compete every season while he's in the NBA. But I think someone cheaper than Grant will be the option for the LA Lakers. My number 5 team here is the Philadelphia 76ers, because this is potentially a team that can get them out from Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons has not played for the Philadelphia 76ers this season. It is not looking like he's ever going to play for the Philadelphia 76ers ever again. So they have to find a way to swap contract for contract, at least somewhat close. I know there's going to have to be other players involved in this deal if he does go to the 76ers, but if he goes to this team, it's another versatile, solid defensive player, can provide some offensive numbers. He's going to be in a starting lineup most likely with a Maxey, Curry, Harris, and Embiid, and I think that's a very good defensive. I mean, even if you take Danny Green off the bench, he's a very good perimeter defender. A lot of different options you can do, a lot of different pieces you can move around defensively with that type of lineup. Again, it's not a star, or he's not anyone that's going to blow you away, but they need to find a way to move on to get some value in return for the Ben Simmons deal. I think Detroit can certainly be an option. I think Detroit has no reason to not be interested in Simmons while they're working in their rebuild right now. So I look at Detroit, I look at Philadelphia, and I think they could possibly make a move here with Jerami Grant, who also, I believe, he played earlier in his career
He
with the
did. I was
Philadelphia
going to say,
76ers. So
I think he was drafted by them back in the day.
it's certainly good to know what Philadelphia is like before going into a market like that.
No doubt. I like that trade. I do like that trade, especially for a Philadelphia team who you see night in and night out. Joel Embiid is putting himself right up there, at least in my personal opinion, as a top 3 MVP candidate. But like
Should
you
be.
alluded to in our talks prior to the start of the show, is that you were talking about how Joel Embiid, he's got to get another player next to him. He can't keep on doing this. Again, the help of Maxey is great. Tobias Harris is doing nicely. But the Ben Simmons drama continues, and they need somebody to essentially replace him. And a guy you bring in that has familiarity with the city. Obviously, that was a long time ago, because I think this is his year number 7 or 8 in the league. That team has obviously changed a lot since 7, 8 years ago. That was a time and point where
Yeah,
they were tanking for first round
terrible,
picks, if you remember.
terrible
But
team.
they need a fresh face in there. They need an energy boost, and I think a guy adding to that team, a 20-point per game scorer, can really do that.
So what do you have for number 4?
So number 4, I have the Minnesota Timberwolves. They've quietly been a good team in the Western Conference with the likes of a Karl Anthony Towns, D'Angelo Russell coming back, and Anthony Edwards, who I think is shocking a lot of people in what he's doing this year.
It's not shocking.
Well, based on his first year, we knew that he was going to be a good player. But
Okay,
there
fine.
was there was there was there was a lot of talk there, and he wasn't shooting the ball efficiently. In fact, he was taking a lot of shots a game and not knocking any down. Now we're seeing his shooting percentages all the way up to 44%, averaging 22.5 points per game, 5 rebounds, and almost 4 assists per game, with a steal and a half per game as well, 40% from the free throw line, and a 37% three-point shooter. This guy is kind of an all-around type player, but they have no depth whatsoever. They have nobody after those 3 players in which I just listed. And I think that they, sitting at the number, I believe, 7 spot right now in the Western Conference, they're a youthful team that is looking to build, and I think they're on the up and up. And adding a player in a Jerami Grant, it adds you a veteran-like player who in and of himself is a young player. I believe he's around 27 or 26 years old himself, even though he's been in the NBA now for about 7 years. But another guy that adds points and defense to this Minnesota Timberwolves team, because after those first 3 guys that I just listed, who do they really got? They got a Malik Beasley, a Vanderbilt, a Patrick Beverly. They don't have many options. Taurean Prince is having a down year. I thought that was going to be a guy to come off the bench for them that was going to give him some solid minutes, only playing less than 15 minutes a game, averaging around 4 points per game. Had some solid years with Cleveland, solid years with Atlanta, solid years with Brooklyn, but not doing the same right now in Minnesota Timberwolves uniform. And with that being said, I think this trade would look like a Taurean Prince, Malik Beasley, Maybe even a Jaden McDaniels added in there, and probably a first round pick, I'd have to say, to get the deal done to add Jerami Grant to the Minnesota Timberwolves roster.
Yeah, Timberwolves are my number 4 team as well. I think this team makes a lot of sense. I feel like the Timberwolves for a couple years now have been looking for a Jerami Grant type player to play at power forward next to Karl Anthony Towns. Vanderbilt has been a very nice presence for the Timberwolves, but he doesn't really provide much offensively. He's an extremely good rebounder
Mhm.
for the 4 spot, but when I look at the Timberwolves, I think this makes a lot of sense. He goes into a starting lineup where you know what his role is exactly going to be. He provides a more of an offensive game than some of the other options they have at that 4 spot right now. His contract doesn't kill you, and he puts you in a better position in a very difficult conference. I don't think losing Malik Beasley is a huge deal. Again, he's solid, from a or he's a solid scorer, but they already have some solid scoring options already on this team. If they can improve defensively, if they can improve their versatility on the wing, and get someone like a Jerami Grant, I think that makes a ton of sense for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Plus, you talk about some of the players they get in return. It seems like Detroit loves going after these ridiculously athletic guys to see if one of them can kind of stick in. I mean,
Yeah,
one time, they went after Hamidou Diallo. They tried getting
yeah,
Bol before his failed physical. I
yeah.
think they would love to go after a Vanderbilt or McDaniels, one of those other young guys in a trade too, which would definitely interest them. But I think Minnesota would be an absolutely excellent location for Grant if he was to move on from the Detroit Pistons. Kyle, let's go on to number 3. Who do you have in that spot?
I have the Washington Wizards here, and I know that might sound surprising because it seems like they do have a lot of players that essentially have the skill set of a Jerami Grant, and maybe that might not necessarily be the need in which they may necessarily primarily need. But when I look at this Wizards team, they're sitting right now in the 7th spot in the Eastern Conference, or the 8th spot in the Eastern Conference, and they sit only about 3.5, 4 games out of a 4th or 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. That's how close they are to being up there with some of the top teams, and especially with injuries taking place to guys like Lonzo Ball and Zach LaVine with the Bulls, and with the Brooklyn Nets losing Kevin Durant now and only having Kyrie for half the home games. This is a team that's probably a trade away from jumping themselves up into that top conversation. I think they're that close. When I look at this team, really when you break it down, they have some solid players. We obviously know what Bradley Beal brings to the table. Montrezl Harrell has been a nice addition. Kyle Kuzma's having a great year as well for him, kind of rejuvenation of his career. But they don't have that offensive influx that I think they're looking for right now. They're not, even though they don't necessarily have the shooters. We know with Jerami Grant playing, he's an all around type of player. You said it before. You can move him all around on the court. Great defensive player, 20-point per game scorer, can rebound. He does it all. When you look at this roster, they have a lot of young players and a lot of guys that are kind of underachieving. Spencer Dinwiddie, I thought was going to be a great acquisition, shooting under 40% from the field and under 31% from the 3-point line. And you saw in his years with Brooklyn, he was going to be like a great player, and he hasn't been that right now with the Wizards. So I think that when you break down this trade, they got a lot of youth to trade, which I think works in their favor. Montrezl Harrell, I think, would be added in this trade, averaged around 25 minutes per game, 14 points per game. Arroyo Hachimura, who I think we both agree is a great player with tremendous upside, but he's just
Hmm.
so injury prone that I don't know if the Wizards are a team right now that can, I don't want to say cash in or wait for his development and wait for that season where he turns it around and becomes healthier. And maybe a Raul Neto and maybe a first round pick or something like that to make the money work and make it more intriguing for the Detroit Pistons. But I think that's what a Washington Wizards trade would look like for Jerami Grant.
I think Washington would be a great location for them, or for Grant. I think Washington would be a great location for Jerami Grant. I personally think Washington should go in a direction that improves their 3-point shooting. I don't think Grant would be a bad option, but I do think there's some other players I have them at least targeting in free agency. I do not have them on my list for Jerami Grant. At number 3, I have the Memphis Grizzlies, who are one of the surprise teams in the Western Conference this year. We recently did a video on the Grizzlies and why they're a team you certainly can't sleep on in the West. Kyle, when I look at their roster, like, yes, they have Morant, Bain, Jackson, Adams. They'll eventually have Dylan Brooks returning, Brandon Clark. Zaire Williams is a rookie. They're really missing that ultra athletic, versatile wing, I feel like. Now, yes,
Hmm.
Zaire is one. going to be someone they expect to be that down the road and has improved recently as he's gotten more starting minutes. But I certainly think if they can add another depth guy who plays similar to a Jerami Grant would make a ton of sense. He's a guy who was always an underdog. He's someone who has definitely performed much greater to the expectations he was given when he entered the NBA. He can play the three, to play the four, defend multiple positions. I think he would come to Memphis and fit in absolutely perfectly on day one. They're a team that doesn't have a ton of money tied in, so they could move him if there was, a pick or young player swap. And he has 2 years left on his deal. That's right before they have to give an extension to Ja Morant. So when his deal expires, they then pay him his long-term deal. I think the money makes sense. I think the fit makes sense. I think the way he fits their system makes sense. I think Grant would be excellent on the Memphis Grizzlies.
I like that a lot. I like that a lot. And I think that would actually be a tremendous trade. Obviously, again, this trade is not about star-studdedness, but Memphis, which we talked about last week in the video that we put out, is that they're missing the star veteran presence. And although Jerami Grant is a young player, he's had some playoff legitimacy experience when he was with the Nuggets. He's had some time with OKC back in the day, playing with Russell Westbrook, along the likes of other players as well. So he has some veteranness to bring to the table. And I think that if you place him in there with a starting lineup of probably a Ja, you'd have it one, obviously, a Dylan Brooks at the two. You move Grant to the three. You have Jaren Jackson at the four and Steve Adams at the five. That's a solid lineup. And then the bench that they have is tremendous. But Alec, I might have missed this. I don't know if you said this or not. What would that trade entail? What would that look like for Jerami Grant for the Grizzlies?
So there would definitely be draft picks included. They
Okay.
have a ton of different young player options to choose from. I mean, from an expiring contract perspective and a money movement standpoint, I do think moving on from Kyle Anderson would be a move. I think getting more athletic at that spot would make a ton of sense. Kyle Anderson, yes, he's Mr. Slowman. I do think he's a little bit underrated for the people that actually watch him play.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think he would be one of the guys who'd be off the board. Then we just look at some of their options for young player perspective. I mean, you look down the list, it seems like they have a ton of different guys to choose from. I mean, Jones, Culver, Zaire. I mean, I don't think I'd move on from him. I mean,
I think
Brandon
Clark
Clark
might
only
be.
has 2 years on a deal. I think he's definitely the guy I think that would get moved, especially
Yeah.
because you have a Steven Adams already on your team. You do have already paid Jaren Jackson, eventually going to pay Ja Morant. Eventually someone's going to have to move here, and I definitely wouldn't move on from Brooks or Bain,
No.
which puts, Clark there in the conversation to get moved on. Do you think some picks? Anderson, Clark, maybe another young guy there or two. I think Memphis can really make a move here because again they can make his contract work.
Yeah. No, I like that trade. I do like that
So
trade.
watch out for the Grizzlies, man. Oh, if they got him, they would be really scary in the West.
Yeah. It'd be a ridiculously athletic team, too.
So my top two haven't been mentioned yet, which I'm pretty excited about. Who do you have as your number 2 team for Jerami Grant?
So for Jerami Grant, number 2 team that I have on my list is the Atlanta Hawks. And I have the Atlanta Hawks here. I know what you might
Wow.
be
I
saying.
don't even have them listed.
I know what you might be saying, and you might be saying in the fact that, oh, don't they have a player like that in John Collins? And yes, they do. But I'm making this assumption with the fact that I think that John Collins is going to be moved on from at this deadline. Reading reports about how the Atlanta Hawks had delivered a trade package to the Philadelphia 76ers for Ben Simmons and Tobias Harris, which was centered around a John Collins, a Cam Reddish, and a first-round pick. Obviously, Cam Reddish gets traded to the Knicks. That trade falls apart. But if you guys have been paying attention to basketball, and really since the beginning of the season, it seems like, which is weird because that's when he got his extension, is he just seems unhappy there, and it seems like he wants to get out of there. And so I think that they're going to move on from, especially the way that Atlanta is playing, because Alec, like you talked about, this is a team that was so good last year. This was a team that was in the Final Four, even though there was a lot of injuries to some of the cream of the crop, all-star talent in the NBA by position. This team still finished in the top 4 and beat the teams in which they played in the New York Knicks in the first round and the Philadelphia 76ers in the second round to move on to play the Milwaukee Bucks. John Collins is a terrific player, but I think that him being unhappy there, I think they're going to look to move on. And being that they stand at the 12 spot with all these huge contracts, I think that they have to unfortunately unload some of these big deals, and John Collins is one of them. So I think that if you unload that contract, get potentially a not obviously this trade, to make clear, by the way, with what I'm saying, Detroit would not be trading Jerami Grant for John Collins. But I think that the Detroit Pistons and the Atlanta Hawks make this trade, being that that trade has already taken place to get that offensive rejuvenation, a smaller contract, a shorter term contract, and I think what it consists of is a Onyeka Okongwu, maybe a Danilo Gallinari, and a first round pick. That way, Okongwu, when they drafted him, it just seems like that pick is not really fitting into their system. With John Collins and Clint Capella there, it seems like there's no room for him to necessarily grow with the Atlanta Hawks. And then a Danilo Gallinari, who a lot of people thought was a great signing when they made it, and is really, to be quite blunt, has kind of failed. Has kind of failed. I don't think they're getting the production in which they envisioned when they signed him to a 70, $80 million contract. So I think that's what a trade would look like for a Jerami Grant.
Yeah, I don't have the Hawks on my list. I don't not exactly sold they trade Collins now. I could definitely see him being an offseason candidate if he continues to be unhappy. We'll have to wait and see. Could we potentially do a video on John Collins? We'll have to wait and see, Kyle, later in this trade window. My number 2 team is the Chicago Bulls. Now, going into the season, it looked like that role on the team, the versatile four, the athletic wing, was going to be Patrick Williams. He unfortunately injured himself. He will be out for the year. And, you know, you look at Chicago's team, they have everything really but that one player. Now, yes, Lonzo Ball is hurt. The Bulls are hoping that Kobe White can replace him while he's injured. He's been excellent recently for the Bulls while they've been dealing with some players out with COVID. But, you know, you look at their starting lineup when healthy: Ball, Levine, DeRozan, and Vucevic. They could use that fifth guy, that number 4 player, and I think he would fit in that role absolutely perfectly. Now, players going back to Detroit, you'd have to think Derek Jones, with his expiring contract just under $10 million, could likely be on the way out. Patrick Williams, yes, he's injured, but has 2 years remaining on his deal, both worth less than $10 million per season. I think that would absolutely be of interest for the Detroit Pistons, as they are currently working on their rebuild. Maybe another young player there, a draft pick. There'd have to be other things involved, I think, for Detroit to accept that trade. But the Bulls really need that one guy to be a true contender in the East. I think they are, but another guy on the wing like Grant is the perfect fit to complete that starting rotation.
Now, Alec, with my number 1 spot, I completely agree with you. That's the Chicago Bulls for me, and especially
Okay.
after what was announced earlier today with Lonzo Ball being out for the next 6 to 8 weeks, and you
Yeah.
have Zach Levine still dealing with a knee injury, left knee soreness. I believe he's dealing with. He's not even going to be playing on this road trip that the Bulls are going to be going on. So I think that you need to make a trade, a splash trade like this, and I think that a Patrick Williams and a Derek Jones Jr., maybe a first round pick, which you already talked about, would be the perfect trade package for both teams. You get a youthful player for the Detroit Pistons and Patrick Williams, and you get a guy off the Chicago Bulls that necessarily doesn't fit their timeline, right? The Chicago Bulls, the way they constructed their offseason, this is a win now type of team. This isn't a lot with players like Vucevic, with players like DeRozan. These are older players that are still in their prime, but maybe only have a solid, I want to say maybe 3, 4 years left of this type of production left in them. Zach Levine is going to be great for a long time. Lonzo Ball, I think, has found a home in Chicago, but they need that type of move and they need that type of play, because when you look at a lineup of potentially a Lonzo Ball, a Zach Levine, a Jerami Grant, a DeMar DeRozan, and a Nikola Vucevic, that's a tremendous lineup. And then you have guys like Alex Caruso off the bench. You have guys like Kobe White off the bench, key contributors. The guy in which they drafted at Illinois this year has been a great contributor as well. Don Sumo, I believe his name is. They need that type of production to keep themselves, I don't want to say relevant, because I don't think they're going to fall off tremendously. But you got to look at where they're at now at the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. And when you got teams like Miami climbing up there, and you got teams all in the Eastern Conference, because a lot of the teams in which we mentioned for Jerami Grant are a lot of Eastern Conference teams. I know, at least with my list, having the Falcons in there, the Wizards in there, and obviously Chicago in there. And I know you had the Sixers as well. Those are all teams, at least the Wizards and the Sixers, that are competing in that Eastern Conference for higher seeds. And if that move gets made by those teams, those are teams that could potentially move up in the conference, where I think the Bulls right now, losing Alonzo for as long as they're losing him, losing a Zach LaVine, not really a timeline of return, they could potentially falter and fall down in the Eastern Conference.
So, Kyle, my number one team is not in the Eastern Conference. I watched them play the other day, blow a game to the Houston Rockets. And when I watch them play, I think they're an efficient team. They're a very solid defensive team. They're a team that plays well in the regular season, but have struggled to turn that corner and be successful in the postseason. And that team is the Utah Jazz. And they're a team I really like this year. They're a team I really like every year, it seems like. Mike Conley, Donovan Mitchell, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Rudy Gobert are four very solid players in that rotation. Royce O'Neal is not exactly not exactly a well-known name, but if you watch the Jazz play, he's someone you definitely notice on the court, kind of that glue guy, gritty, solid defensive player. Jordan Clarkson, Hassan Whiteside, when healthy, two very solid players off the bench, but you watch them play, and Joe Ingles and Bogdanovich are pretty similar players. Rudy Gay is a little bit older, not as athletic as he used to be. I think if the Jazz really need one more player, it's that super versatile wing they could enter into the starting lineup, move Royce O'Neal to the bench. And if they could get a Jerami Grant type player into this starting lineup, I think that massively helps them here in the Western Conference. Because I still look at the Utah Jazz as a very good regular season team, but I don't look at this team as beating one of the other top seeds in the or Western Conference to get to an NBA championship. And I do think adding a high energy player like Grant is exactly what they need. Now, does Grant make them the best team in the West? It's going to be very hard to defeat the Golden State Warriors, but I do think the Jazz need to get more player to make them legitimate here in the Western Conference.
I like that team a lot, and defensively, I mean, you already know the pieces around there in Utah, especially with Rudy Gobert, who always has his name in the candidacy for Defensive Player of the Year, and then you just
Did
add
again this
an
year.
athletic freak in Jerami Grant, who could also score and help rebound as well. Great free throw shooter, great shooter in general. Not the best 3-point shooter, but you add that as well to a team that I think is really missing that as well. Because I think Joe Ingles was never that athletic guy, but was supposed to be that wing type player that really isn't playing up to his contract or playing up to the need of the Utah Jazz right now. So that could maybe be a piece that they add in that trade,
Absolutely. Oh,
especially because,
he absolutely would go. Because if you look
yeah,
at, they don't want to trade Bogdanovich. He's been
no,
averaging like 17 to 20 per game the
no,
last
he's
three
a
or four
great
years.
under the radar player.
He's been
Great.
awesome. It would be Ingles for because he makes 14 mil. Grant makes about 20 mil.
Hmm.
And then they'd probably move on from definitely some draft picks. They don't have many great young players.
Maybe
Maybe they
they
could
add
move
like
on.
a Pascal or maybe a Jared Butler, who I know
Yeah,
was,
I mean, those would probably be
yeah.
their best option. I mean, they definitely have to use some picks here to make Detroit interested, but
Hmm.
I think that the fit here in Utah is exactly what they need. Because I mean, you watch them play, and you just think, man, like if they could get that one more super athletic guy, it'd make a ton of sense. I
It
think they
would.
should get on the phone with the Pistons and make a trade. There's a good chance Jerami Grant gets traded here. A very good player on a very bad team, and would be a huge piece for a lot of contending teams in the NBA. Kyle, before I let you go, of course, where can my listeners keep in touch with you on social media?
So on social media, at Kyle Russo 612 on Instagram. And if you look to follow me on my podcast that I'm a part of on Review and Preview, like Alec alluded to, every Tuesday night from 7 to 9 o'clock on Facebook Live. And you really find our podcast on any podcast listening platform that you have. And that's where I can be found. If you like what I've said, obviously give me a follow. And if you like what I said, we mention a lot of things and talk about a lot of things that we talk here on the Alec Walt Show on Review and Preview. Football, basketball, going to be getting into some baseball soon potentially. But some good
Hopefully.
stuff on Review and Preview. But that's where you can follow me at Alec. And again, once again, as always, thank you for having me on, man. Really do appreciate it.
That's going to be it for this episode of the Alec Walt Show. I'm your host, Alec Walt, alongside Kyle Russo. Where do you think Grant gets traded before the NBA trade deadline? Feel free to give me your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more of my exclusive content. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you very soon.